Good afternoon, friends. Welcome to the Puffin Cultural Forum and our ongoing series of interviews with noted writers. We have an extraordinarily interesting program for you this afternoon, and I'll introduce our guest in just a moment. Let me say a word about myself, however. I'm Joseph Chuman. I'm a leader of the New York Society for Ethical Culture. I also teach human rights at Columbia University and occasionally at Hunter College. Our guest this afternoon is Professor Richard Koszarski. He's a professor emeritus of English and Cinema Studies at Rutgers University. He was formerly the curator of the Museum of the Moving Image in Astoria and is the founder and emeritus editor of Film History. He is the author of many books on cinema and recently was the founder, I should say, of the Barrymore Museum in Fort Lee, New Jersey. And if you're in the area, I encourage you to visit it. It's a fascinating and beautiful, beautiful addition to Bergen County. This afternoon, I'll be discussing with Richard Koszarski his latest book, Keep 'Em in the East, Kazan, Kubrick, and the Post-War New York Renaissance, a book published last year by Columbia University. I have a copy here. Here it is. I encourage you to get it, read it, study it, okay, and learn from it. It is truly a magisterial work of about 500 pages, which leads me to my first question, Richard. Let me say, first of all, good afternoon and welcome to Puffin. Right. My first question really doesn't deal with the content of the book, which we'll spend most of our delving into. It actually deals with the method by which you researched it. I was blown away by the amount of and the quality of the research. Hundreds of films, hundreds of characters and personalities, the backstories of how these movies were created, the knowledge that goes into this book and comes out of it is truly extraordinary. It is, to use the word prodigious, really understates this task. How in the world, I'm asking myself as I'm reading it, how in the world did this man do the research for this book? It's exhaustive. Tell us a little bit before we get into the content. I'm really interested in the method. How did you put this book together?
Well, actually, it took many years. I was a student in a doctoral program at NYU Cinema Studies, when they began in the early 1970s. And in the early 1970s, the history of American film, it was basically mythologized in a straight line, so that there was Thomas Edison in the East, and they invented movies, and they made a few movies in the East, like The Great Train Robbery, and then everybody went to Hollywood. And then it becomes the history of Hollywood equals the history of American cinema. And even when I was in graduate school, basically that's the way they taught it. There was one professor, William K. Everson, who did sort of say, yes, and they were also making movies in the East, around New York, a few movies, nice. But you couldn't find that in the history books, because the history books followed what they called a spotlight theory. So the spotlight is on New York, and then the spotlight moves to Hollywood, or maybe in European cinema, it's on France, and then it goes to Germany, and then it goes to Russia for a while, then it goes back to Italy. So this spotlight had moved away from New York. And I thought, like everyone else, there's nothing happened in the East except, well, they kept the executive offices in the East and so on. 1977, I received my doctorate. I'm looking for work. I hear that they're going to start this to rehabilitate the film studio, the old Paramount film studio in Astoria, which had been used by the Signal Corps since World War II. And they needed a cultural fig leaf in order to be able to get nonprofit monies and things. So maybe they needed historians. So I began hanging around there. And they had hired Tom and Dancy Hoving. And Tom Hoving had just left the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where he had been the director for a long time. Mm-hmm. And the Hoving Associates, were going to write a reuse study for this historic site. What can you do that would mix the commercial activities like rehabilitating the stages with some kind of nonprofit, should there be a school here? Should there be, film archive, use the old film vaults or something, maybe a museum. So I worked with Tom Hoving for a while, and I had to train myself in the notion of, why is this place important? I had hardly heard about the Paramount studio in New York, even though it had been very active since Paramount built it in 1920. So I began working on things like oral history programs. Well, we're going to interview folks who worked here, first for Paramount on commercial movies in the 20s and 30s, and then since Pearl Harbor, Army guys, Signal Corps Photographic Center guys. And one of the things I was told by the Army people is that the reason that when you were in graduate school and during Vietnam, never heard that there was this huge Signal Corps movie studio making all of the Army training films in Queens is because we had hired press agents to keep our names out of the studio, so that while you students were protesting at the draft headquarters downtown Manhattan, nobody ever showed up at the Signal Corps studio, because basically people didn't know about it, and we didn't want them to know about it, which was fine at the time, I guess, for their purposes. But then when they were trying to celebrate the historic value and function of this, it was a little difficult, because it had been erased. It had been erased from history. In fact, it had been erased to such a degree that if you went back to the various city planning offices to look for the blueprints of where the buildings were created, they had disappeared, because as a piece of federal property, it had become delisted on municipal records. So it didn't exist. It was this missing spot. So we had to start researching the history of the place, because they were planning to apply for grants to say, give us money, we have a historic venue here, and this is why it was historic. So suddenly, from somebody who basically talked about Erich von Stroheim and Hollywood silent movies, I had to become this New York film historian.
Uh-huh.
That started with doing oral histories, and we would try to find people who survived, who we could still talk to, Gloria Swanson or Louise Brooks, or an occasional director, and a lot of Army people. And of course, one of the things you learned about the Army period, which again is completely written out of history. I mean, no general film history would bother to mention the thousands of Army films that were made in a place like this, unless maybe Frank Capra had worked on them during the war, or John Huston, or, if a Hollywood person had worked on them, then they were worth talking about within the context of his career. But the fact that you had this huge nonfiction film industry developing in New York in the 1940s and 50s, through the benefit of federal money, that was just written out, that was just written out. Even though the fact that New York had this great nonfiction production base became important in the commercial revival later on. It's where movies like Naked City would come from later on. Right. So basically, I spent years working on this. They did, the Hovings turned over the report. Later on, a museum was started. I was hired by the museum. I became a curator of the museum. And so the museum was trying to do the whole world of cinema, but also with a focus on New York City. And we became a kind of sort of de facto depot of information. Some old cameraman or electrician would come in and say, hey, here's a box of stills that I had. Or let me tell you stories about when Ingrid Bergman made Army training films here, or George Cukor was here. Or so, so we would have all this information. And I wrote things at the time while I was working there, but even after leaving in there in '97, I said, I'm the only one who's sitting on all this knowledge. I have this responsibility to get it out, and I'm not going to get it out in a nice, 289-page book. This is going to take a long time, and so far it's taken two big volumes, and I only got up to 1955.
Really quite amazing. So the origins of this book started long before you even conceived writing it. And there was a type of mission to basically bring into the light of day what was a hidden history unknown. And, you know, as I read this book, I figured that was a motif that sort of animated you throughout it, because there is so much information that I'm sure very few people, if anybody, knows about, that you're for the first time bringing to the forefront of recognition with regard to many of the details, the interstices, the details, the hidden aspects, the unknowns of how films were created. I would say there were probably hundreds of films listed and reviewed in this book. So there's this sort of unearthing of unknown data, which I think follows you through the book, which you, and in fact, have accomplished. It's really quite extraordinary.
Well, part of the project of the book was to say that there were, and the period of the book is from 1945 to about 1955.
Yes.
And even histories that try to talk about New York cinema say, well, there were a handful of films made. There was The Naked City, you know, then there was Little Fugitive, if you want to talk about indie films, On the Waterfront. Maybe they'll talk about The House on 92nd Street or Lost Weekend, and that's about it. My research indicated that there were about 200 feature films that were shot either entirely or in part in New York. Now, you could say there were probably 200 films shot in Monument Valley or at the Grand Canyon too. You know, Hollywood companies, you know, they put all their cameras and equipment on trucks and they went out to Monument Valley to film a John Ford Western. And, you know, that's a film that was made out there. But there's no indigenous filmmaking infrastructure out there in those places. Those are just interesting places to make a movie.
Right.
What you had in New York is two different things. Yes, there were Hollywood companies who simply put their equipment on a train, you know, unloaded it, made their movie and went back. But there were also indigenous local New York filmmakers who had their own equipment. They had their own laboratories here. They had their own cadres of either both technical workers, writers, actors, producers, many of them who had been working on those nonfiction documentaries. Others had been working in the theater. Some had been working in radio. And so when the time came after World War II to move away from Hollywood for lots of reasons, there are big changes in the American film industry, New York was prepared for this. New York had been making movies ever since Edison, even at this low level of work. You know, they hadn't been making all that many feature-length films. The feature-length films, you know, they were what were made at the factory. The movie companies would make those films at their factory site, and they put the factory in a good place to put the factory, which in this case turned out to be Southern California. But everything else had stayed here in the East, the executive offices, the laboratories, developmental workshops, and so on. And so New York was prepared where, say, Chicago was not, where Texas was not, despite the fact that they wanted films to come back to there. They wanted films to be made in San Francisco, and they tried to make a few, but it didn't take the way it took in New York. So now New York film activity is rolling. You know, they don't have enough space anymore to make movies and television and streaming shows.
Right. Well, okay, we'll get into that, which is really the content, the meat and potatoes of your book, so to speak. But you lay out at the very beginning in your introduction what your thesis is. And that is that there was a movie renaissance in New York in the 1960s, characterized by such films as Midnight Cowboy, which I have to say I personally loved, The Godfather, The French Connection, Annie Hall, and so on and so forth. But your thesis is that the groundwork for that renaissance in the 60s was actually laid in the period that you're mentioning. The book focuses on the post-war period, the late 40s and the early 50s. Okay, can you, and you began to do this, Richard, but can you elaborate a little bit more on the nature of filmmaking in that era in New York City? What types of films were being made? How were they put together? How were they financed? What did the industry in that earlier period look like?
Well, the early period, You mean the period in this
No, I
particular
mean the
book,
period of the
or
book,
the whole?
the period, the post-war
Well, the period in this
Yeah.
book. Okay, so in the 1920s and 30s, you have the sort of decayed residue of the typical American, movie making. A lot of it had been in the East, and then less and less and less of it was in the East, and then it sort of started to change character. And then in the war, it flatlined. Feature films flatlined because of government restrictions on access to motion picture stock. And what the government said during the war was, we're rationing film stock. Now, look, you guys out there, at MGM and Paramount, you'll get the same amount of film stock, you got last year, no more. You people who want to make independent films, say you're making Yiddish movies or race pictures for African-American audiences, or some other kind of independent film, well, you're not going to get any. So suddenly, the idea that you could have an independent cinema operating outside of Hollywood in New York, it went on ice during World War II in terms of theatrical feature-length pictures. However, there was all of this nonfiction and documentary activity. A lot of it, of course, coming right through the Signal Corps. That's below the radar. It's below the radar of film historians. I mean, people write books of film history. That history is the history of feature-length movies that you'd see in a theater, right? It tends not to include newsreels, tends not to include cartoons, tends not to include Yiddish pictures. Those things are considered marginal and not part of this easy stream. It's easy to write a history of that. One reason this book that I have to write is so full of references to movies that are not really well known is because that history was scattered. It had never been sort of raked together in between one set of covers before. And so I felt I had the responsibility to do that. Now, look, when production moved out to the West Coast, Paramount continued to make films in New York in the 30s, but they made social melodramas, people in evening gowns and living in penthouses and that kind of. They didn't make westerns here, obviously, right? They didn't make things that needed big sets like war movies. They did all that stuff. The Ten Commandments, they made all that stuff on the West Coast, and they tended to make these little interior films in the East, which meant that they shrank the kind of genre pictures they made. For example, one good reason to have a big studio with a studio lot in Hollywood is that you can have standing sets, right? So you could have a standing jungle set there, which means you could make a series of Tarzan movies. You build the same jungle, Tarzan this, Tarzan that, and the next Tarzan. You have the jungle is there, right? Or you want to make the Bowery Boys. You have a standing set of the New York street. So you can just keep going back to this. This is where they live. They live on this same set. And since you've built the same set, you could build a lot of other films set in New York or some other urban place. The New York studios, no matter how well equipped they may have been, they didn't have big back lots, and they couldn't maintain standing sets throughout the winter. So we never made series pictures like that. There was never anything like the Bowery Boys made in New York City because they lacked standing set capacity here, right? So what you are going to do is make films, whether they're dramas or comedies, that is like one-off productions. Oh, I bought the rights to this book. Okay, so I'll do that. Oh, I got a play. Or I have an idea for original detective movie. So I can do that. That was against the business model of the 1930s, which was you make large numbers of films, you make them as similar as possible because you have the technical facilities, the buildings on the back lot, the actors under contract, who were familiar with making dancing musicals or who were familiar with making Charlie Chan mysteries or whatever, right? In New York, that didn't exist. So when films revived after the war, it was in terms of these sort of independent one-off projects. Somebody would say, oh, I'm going to make a film and it'll turn out to be Little Fugitive. Or I'm going to make a film and it turns out to be On the Waterfront. There is no On the Waterfront 2. There's no series of On the Waterfront films. The films that were being made by these filmmakers in New York in the post-war period were one-off productions which suited the distribution climate after the war. And you know why it did that? Because of something called the Paramount Decrees. You ever hear of the Paramount Decrees? There was an antitrust case that government prosecuted for many years, beginning in the 1920s. And they said that Paramount Theaters and the Paramount Studio were linked together in a conspiracy and restraint of trade, right? They were keeping independent filmmakers from having access to those good theaters. So by 1947, the government succeeded with this Paramount antitrust case, and they said, look, you have to split up the theaters and the studios. So Lowe's Incorporated, that owned MGM, had to split from MGM, and then the Lowe's theaters had to say, in theory, well, we'll take films from anybody now. Everybody has a fair shot. That had all kinds of ramifications about how movies were made in Hollywood, which we don't have time to get into here. But in a sense, it helped people who had a little bit of money, little capital. Maybe they were working somewhere else other than Hollywood. They say, I would like to go into the movie business. Instead of putting my money into a play, I'm going to put a little money into a detective mystery or something and shoot it in New York. And guess what? Now I actually have a shot to get my independent film into these theaters. So where Hollywood was in a dither because their business model had been destroyed when the link between the studios and the theaters were dissolved, these independent little outfits, actually, they saw an opportunity and they flew into this little opening that they saw for a while, really, at least until other circumstances came to undermine that.
Well, okay. I mean, that characterizes one major dynamic in the New York movie scene. And as part of that, I wanted to ask you a question. One thing that fascinated me, among others, in this book was the proliferation in New York City and its environs of these small studios all over the place, that in warehouses and abandoned buildings and whatever, that sprung up in this period, which is a piece with what you're talking about in terms of how small producers could make films. I was impressed. Could you talk a little bit? They seem to spring up like mushrooms here, there, and everywhere. Can you talk a little bit about these small studios? One, the Pathé Studio, you devote an entire chapter to. Yeah. If you can focus on the importance of that studio within the context of these proliferating little places that were used to produce movies in New York City.
Well, first of all, you have to ask yourself, what constitutes a studio? In the silent days, it was very easy to have a studio. You could just rent loft space, warehouse space, hang a couple of lights in there, and you have a studio. It became more difficult when sound came in because sound recording equipment was with limited quality, and you had all these acoustical issues. So you needed good sound equipment and you needed fireproofed spaces. So there was a sort of a change in what could constitute a studio. A lot, especially in the 30s, again, because it was difficult to record sound outdoors with all this traffic noise and things, birds flying overhead. They didn't take advantage of exterior shooting so much. So everything was being moved indoors, and Hollywood simply had bigger sound stages than they could have in New York. Things do change after the Second World War. First of all, they've got sound equipment that's more flexible. It's easier to use. You actually can move into a real home. So if you look at a movie like Naked City, some of the interiors in Naked City, like the police station, where there's a lot of dialogue, are shot on a set built in Hollywood. But some of the interiors in Naked City, like where the young police lieutenant live and his wife, that's actually shot inside a row house in Astoria. And you can see, the camera is like in a corner looking up, and you can see it's just somebody's actual house, and it sounds a little hollow compared to the perfect movie sound that I'm used to hearing. But that was considered a great advance because you actually could get some kind of recording that would be accessible. Problem is with movies, theater audiences demanded like studio quality recording. And you mentioned the studio that RKO Pathé built. It was on 106th Street. And they had planned this studio for a while. There hadn't been it was the Depression. Nobody was building new movie studios anywhere during the Depression. So there was some work, some studios had been made in the early 30s in Hollywood, but everything was sort of frozen and actually getting a little worn because it hadn't been maintained very much during the war. So RKO Pathé says, okay, we're going to build this big studio on 106th Street. It was a converted fraternal hall, right? So it had these big meeting hall and ballroom spaces. And we're going to make our newsreels here. We're in the business of making a lot of sponsored films. So we're going to make them, and we're going to make feature films there too. And they wind up making films like The Window. You remember that? Window,
yes, I remember seeing that. Yes.
Driscoll. So that film was made in the 106th Street studio. And when they wanted exteriors, they simply went out into the neighborhood around East 106th Street and filmed that stuff over there. Problem with that is, despite the fact that this was the most modern studio in the country, RKO's business collapsed for various other reasons in the late 1940s. So they wound up not making all that many features there. And then, they finally wound up selling it as a television studio. It was a TV studio. And then later on, it had various other histories. In fact, the problem with studios in this period, especially into the 50s and 60s, when they want to make bigger movies with real movie stars, is that there are only a few studios that are capable of doing that. And they're like old studios from the silent movie days that had been refitted, that had been sort of improved. And a film like A Face in the Crowd was shot in the Biograph studio in the Bronx, which had been built for D.W. Griffith in 1913. And it was falling apart. I would talk to cameramen and they'd say, "Oh yeah, I made a film in the Vitagraph studio in Brooklyn, and the floors were unlevel, and you try to move the camera across, and it would fall into a hole in the wooden floor and stuff." So they was, "Oh, we have to build studios. We have to build studios." But the question is, who's going to come up with the money to do that, right? Now the industry wasn't set up to build the sort of quality studios that they want. And I think I have one section in there where I'm talking about all these schemes to float studios, and basically people are trying to find ways to fund those studios. The first one that succeeded was that project that I had been attracted to in the 70s in Astoria, where this was the biggest studio between London and Hollywood. The Paramount Astoria studio used by the Signal Corps, and it was empty, and it was starting to fall apart, and they were drug addicts living in there, and it was full of mattresses that people had brought in, and the city was worried about it, and they were talking about demolishing the thing as an attractive nuisance, just take the whole site and flatten it. But workers in the industry were saying, "Please don't do that. Let's try to find some way of saving it." And it became this complicated public-private partnership, which was really a wonderful accomplishment, in the 1970s, that saved that studio. It's now flourishing, and it served as the nucleus of other film studios, like the Silver Cup studio, which used to be, of course, a bread factory. You see that next to the Queensboro Bridge, and that's been a big studio for a long time. Steiner Stages. So there are many of these other studios now, but it wasn't until the late 70s when films like The Wiz were produced at the old Paramount Astoria studio that the local filmmakers could tell the big shots in Hollywood, "Look, you see The Wiz? $25 million, which is a huge amount of money, but we can make a big musical. That's the most complicated film you guys make in Hollywood, a big musical right here in New York." And when that happened, suddenly Hollywood began looking at it and say, "Oh yes, yeah, I think so. So maybe we can move production in, because we've been worried about your technical facilities."
Right.
But let me just say another thing. It's not just technical facilities that's part of this problem. Technical facilities were easy to talk about, and you'd want to raise money. You'd say, "Give us better technical facilities." But there's also a labor issue. All right. Now, I said that New York did have these cadres of technical workers. They had electricians, cameramen, sound recorders, because they were working in radio. They were working on Broadway. They were working in the New York theater. They were making documentaries. So they were trained people. They could have made a feature-length picture, you know, if they had any place to make it, and anyone who wanted to make it. But the fact that the New York labor situation was so different is also reflected in the fact that it's a different union situation. So the cameramen, the art directors, the electricians in Hollywood belonged to one set of unions. The people in the East belonged to a different regional set of union locals. And they didn't want people to go back and forth, right? When production collapsed in New York during the Depression, a lot of cameramen and electricians said, well, I'll go to Hollywood and get work. But the people in Hollywood, remember, it's the Depression, saying, you know, we don't want you unemployed people here. Go back to New York, you know, and you're not a member of our union local. In fact, our union local will keep you out. And if you want to join our union local, well, that'll take a few years to get on the card. And then if you could be an assistant for a few years, then you can work your way up. So basically, New York way of working was different, partially because of these union restrictions as well. I remember I used to talk to scenic artists, and the scenic artists would say, well, Richard, we're going to do a demonstration for our new members here. And let me tell you that, you know, our members, they can do everything. They can do the greenery, they can do distressing, you know, like making something look old. They can do, you know, plaster work, and each of our members can do everything. And I said, you know, okay, great. Why are you telling me this? It's because in Hollywood, there's one set of guys who only do greenery and another set of guys who only do distressing. And they're the best people in the world to do that. But every movie they make looks exactly like that. There's no inbreeding there. They don't learn from other people. That craft is very limited. So our people, they have to spend a lot of time sort of relearning those skills, but they also bring in new talents, sort of new perspectives. And that was like when people would see a movie like The Hustler in the 1960s, Hollywood was sort of amazed at the look of that film, because even the settings that were built by the New York art directors, it didn't look like what we're doing here. Why is that? Are they spending more money? Are they using real locations? No, it was because they did not have 3 generations of art directors who always made a street curbstone look exactly the same, and they knew perfectly how to do that. You know, everything sort of had to be relearned. That's a function of being a little hungrier. It's a function of not being such a large, massive industry here, and also of having different labor regulations. Now, again, who cares about this? I cared about it because one of the arguments in the book is that the filmmaking that's really regional, it's not just a Hollywood film coming here and making a movie and sending back, but the ideas that are really produced regionally, like Stanley Kubrick's Killer's Kiss is the film I talk about. They have true regional cinema characteristics that are different from West Coast. And you can say this is true about music, right? So music in Philadelphia, you know, rock and roll from Philadelphia is different than rock and roll from the Bronx, right? Jazz from New Orleans is different than jazz from Chicago. And you can point to all sorts of reasons why they're different. So I was trying to find reasons why New York really did have a different regional style than a Hollywood film. It wasn't just because, oh, they were shooting out on the street and using New York actors. No, it was sort of baked into the structure. And that's maybe one of the things that required all of this detail that you talk about, because otherwise it would just be an assertion on my part.
Right. Okay. I mean, there are a lot of questions that come out of what you've just said. I mean, your book really does, another motif is in the book is, in effect, both the cooperation and the tension between New York and Hollywood, the bicoastal relations there, and how some of the films were really hybrids and amalgamated parts that were produced primarily in Hollywood, big productions, but some scenes were filmed in New York City and then incorporated into the movie and factored in, and so on and so forth. One thing that interested me a great deal, having grown up in New York City, was the use of New York City in terms of backdrop scenes, and the fact that films made use of the iconic places in New York, like the Brooklyn Bridge or the Statue of Liberty or the United Nations building or whatever. I wonder if you could talk about New York City as a scenic place. Okay, it's not Monument Valley, but it has a distinctive character all its own. If you can tell us a little bit about how Hollywood employed those scenes, or New York made movies employed, in effect, the iconography of New York City and its very specific places that are globally recognizable.
Well, when Darryl F. Zanuck was making Miracle on 34th Street, right? He said, well, we're gonna go over there, and well, there's this parade, this Thanksgiving parade, and we can incorporate the real parade and think of we could stage it out here in Hollywood, but think of how much better it would be over there. And Zanuck said, oh yeah, New York City, the $1 million back lot, right? Central Park, this is when David O. Selznick came to New York to make Portrait of Jennie. He said, basically, Central Park is going to be the central figure in this movie. All of the magic in that movie is going to happen in Central Park. How the spirit girl sort of keeps reappearing, from time to time. And we could never do Central Park. And we've had Central Park, quote, in a lot of films. So we need to bring the real Central Park here into this movie. And audiences are demanding it now. They've seen all these documentaries during World War II. They won't stand for this kind of stuff. New York was already sort of the iconic city of the 20th century, going back to the beginning. I mean, one reason for that is newsreels. The newsreel business had been based in New York, right? So if they wanted to do a sports figure, well, they could have done, Ty Cobb, or they could have done Dizzy Dean, but, they didn't have much newsreel coverage in St. Louis, or Detroit or Chicago, but they were here in New York. So we heard about Babe Ruth all the time. We heard about Lou Gehrig all the time. We heard about Mayor Walker. We didn't hear so much about whoever was the mayor in Chicago or the mayor in Los Angeles in those days. So the fact that New York did have this central position in where being newspaper chains and especially newsreel companies based here meant that New York was in your face all the time. New York was the American city of the 20th century, where it didn't have to be like that. If you go back to the 1880s and 1890s, people are talking about Chicago being important, and Philadelphia and Boston, being important. But as the image on screen tended to focus more and more and more and more on New York, then suddenly New York took over. New York, as I said, elbowed everyone else out of the way. And if you're in New York and making movies, take advantage of that. I mean, the biggest cliche of these New York movies is the helicopter shot, right? The movie that starts with a helicopter shot of the New York skyline. And Naked City starts with this, and you hear Mark Hellinger's voice saying, we are flying over a city, and this is the story of 8 million people, A Portrait of Jennie opens with that. I mean, I've even seen scripts, they were going to open, on the Waterfront was going to open like that. I saw some, correspondence where they've hired James Wong Howe to fly in with a helicopter, and the helicopter is going to fly over New York and wind up on the docks, So this became a cliche very quickly, but that's because New York skyline was recognizable. And these New York buildings, as you say, were recognizable. The Empire State Building, New York Public Library, Central Park, Brooklyn Bridge.
Right. Okay. You talk about, briefly talk about the role of Yiddish films in terms of keeping the film industry going in that period, but you devote an entire chapter to race movies, that is, movies that were made by Black producers, directors, and had Black actors in them during that period of the 1940s. And I think you do say that you've probably focused on this more than others and have recognized, underscore the contribution that race movies, the contribution that race movies made to what in effect is your thesis. That is the generation of films in the post-war era that eventually led to the film Renaissance. I'd like you to talk about race movies. Who made them? How were they financed? Who were the audiences? To what degree were there crossovers with regard to both actors and audiences? And of course, we have to be interested about how these films were received in the segregated South and how they were dealt with, the whole politics around it. Also, where I'm sort of interested, some of the stars that went on later to become American acting notables got their start during this period in those race movies. So there's a whole basically consortium of issues that come out of it, both political, artistic, and so forth. I'm wondering if you can talk about race movies in that period. Yeah.
Well, in the beginning of this talk, I started discussing the marginalized cinema in New York. You know,
Right.
Nobody is interested in these documentaries or training films. There are all sorts of marginal cinemas that are part of even the American film history, and one of them is the strand of cinema that was targeted to ethnic and even religious groups that felt they did not see themselves on screen. And the most important one of those groups in terms of the length of production in which films directed to this audience were produced were films targeted to African-American audiences. They were called race movies because it's a term that was used in the phonograph industry. So you had the race record category from record distributors, phonograph record distributors. So you had these race records and you're making race movies. The race movies are being made for an African-American audience, not only because the African-American audience doesn't see itself in Hollywood movies for, obvious racist reasons, but because that audience has been restricted to a group of theaters, which then sort of created this little island. It's maybe easier to think about this in terms of the Yiddish films that come along when you have talkies, right? Hollywood is not going to be making Yiddish films. There's a market for Yiddish films, both in this country among immigrant communities, but also internationally. They can sell Yiddish films in Europe and Poland, and various other places. The same or a similar situation exists with race movies, but that happens earlier because you can make silent race movies. And in fact, these pictures start to be made in the late teens. They begin to be made by African-American producers initially. Oscar Micheaux is the best known of these people. He started in Chicago, but by 1920, he's working in New York and New Jersey. And yeah, people have written books about race movies. They begin writing books about them back in the late 1970s. These books start appearing. Prior to then, it was terra incognita. Nobody wrote about race movies any more than they wrote about Yiddish pictures as a part of the American cinema. They didn't even become footnotes. They weren't in the book. It wasn't considered part of the real movies, like independent or underground cinema. They weren't considered part of real movies, but in fact they were. And inside the movie industry, they knew that this was an economically viable business. The trade papers would cover this. They would discuss, how many theaters there were that were handling foreign language movies or were handling films directed to African-American audiences. Now, as you say, some of those theaters in the South were segregated by law. So you say there's a theater that says whites only in this theater, or if you aren't white only, well, you can sit in the balcony of this theater. That segregation was legal. In the North, this segregation was more de facto. It was because the audiences lived in segregated groupings. That doesn't mean you couldn't show a race movie, say, on Times Square, where all audiences might want to show up and see, and sometimes they did. Yiddish films did not just play, for example, in the Lower East Side or other Jewish communities. They would also play in Midtown and other venues. When I'm talking about Yiddish films, the problem with Yiddish films is that the Second World War destroyed their European market. They thought, the war is over, our market is going to come back now. And yet they found that the market wasn't there in Europe because the people had been murdered. They said, well, at least we're going to be able to distribute in Palestine. And then apparently they say there are restrictions on for Yiddish language products.
Yes, right.
So they throw in the towel. So there's really only a few Yiddish films made here after the end of the Second World War. But that's not the case with the race movies. Race movies, which had been sort of going along on a slow boil, many were made in LA, some were made in Texas, Florida, Chicago, also in New York City during the 1930s, anywhere that you could basically rent viable sound equipment. During the period right after World War II, this business takes off in New York. And it takes off in New York. It's in a very complicated way. Did you ever hear of Soundies? Soundies was like a musical jukebox, because it was a jukebox that would play videos, and you'd put your money in, and instead of just hearing a song, you'd be able to see Louis Jordan performing that song. Well, somehow there were thousands of Soundies produced during World War II. I've never actually been able to figure out how they were able to get the money to do that. It might happen because James Roosevelt, the president's son, was one of the heads of the Soundies company. I don't know. But Soundies was able to produce all these musical films. And 20% of the Soundies were black cast Soundies, right? The Soundies weren't only race movie Soundies. They had polkas, they had country music, whatever kind of music they could get. These movies were being made throughout the 1940s, throughout the war. The war ends. Suddenly you can get film stock again. The government says, yeah, anybody who wants to can get film stock from Kodak. Okay, so who jumps in? The first people to jump in are the people who had been making Louis Jordan Soundies and similar movies, and say, well, what we can do is, we'll stitch a few of these musical numbers together, put some little interstitial material, and we have a theatrical film. We'll be able to make a theatrical film about it. When I'm doing my research on, the different films, what were the films made in New York in 46 and 1947? Suddenly I'm astonished to see how many of these are all black cast movies. And yes, those are the ones that were shot initially in converted garages in Fort Lee. They weren't even made in old studios in Fort Lee. They were made in warehouses and garages in Fort Lee and the Bronx, in long abandoned 1920s era movie studios in New York. And in fact, the majority of this feature film production in New York City in the period before, say, Naked City was shot were race movies. This is mind-boggling to me, because there are no books describe this, not even books about race movies, about African-American image in cinema. They would say these films were made and they were good or bad, or there were a lot of them. But when I realized that there was such a big concentration of them here in New York City, and for other reasons that the production had fallen off in California and other states, so the concentration of production was here, that meant that the business was revving up again. The cameramen had work making features again and not just newsreels. Right? The studios dusted off this empty stage space, said, okay, we have a studio. Who else wants to make a movie? Who else wants to? So other people who had been maybe sitting on the sidelines or maybe making shorts said, well, maybe I could do that too. And because of the Paramount decision, guess what? I have a shot of getting my movie into a real theater. So sort of, I don't want to say that on the backs of the race film boom, you find this piling on also of non-race, sort of low budget, locally produced movies. But say in the wake of that, they're making more independent film. I talk about a guy named Joseph Lerner, who was an independent director, producer in New York, who had actually made a race movie with Ruby Dee and Joe Louis. And then he started moving into sort of the real movie business, movies with people like Zachary Scott, detective films. And it was good they did, because the race movie business suddenly collapsed after 1948. And the reason that it suddenly collapsed after 1948 was similar to the reason the Negro Leagues collapsed, because the big leagues suddenly allowed African-American players in. You take that part of the air from the balloon and the whole balloon collapses. In terms of race movies, if you take Lena Horne, if you take Ruby Dee and put them into Hollywood type movies, the talent base has disappeared. And there were other reasons for this as well, in terms of the rising cost of production, which we sort of hit a ceiling there was a ceiling in terms of how much income you could get for a conventional race movie. And once costs, began escalating too far, that sort of stopped that business. But it was extremely important.
Good. As we're going to have to bring our discussion, unfortunately, Richard, to an end. There's, again, a cornucopia of information and questions I have to ask. But as you move towards the end of your book, your story begins to coalesce around two major movie figures and two films that they directed and produced. One of them is Stanley Kubrick and The Killer's Kiss. And the other major figure is Elia Kazan. And of course, On the Waterfront, that you see is paradigmatic of this period. Let's start off with Stanley Kubrick. I remember, of course, as a kid going to see Spartacus in 1960, which I love. This is after the period you're talking about. And then, of course, one of my favorite films I've seen a dozen times is 2001, right, which was a real pathbreaker in terms of science fiction, 1968. But Kubrick started very early. I mean, he was a Jewish kid from the Bronx, right? He was in his early 20s. Arrogant as hell, couldn't keep his shirt in his pants, right? Sort of an idiosyncratic genius as I've seen him. I'd like you to talk about Stanley Kubrick and his early career, moving up to A Killer's Kiss and the type of role that played in this era of filmmaking. And then I want to segue to Elia Kazan, and we have to talk about politics, his hearing before the House Un-American Activities Committee, the whole notion, insinuation of leftism into Hollywood films, and the fallout from that, moving towards On the Waterfront, which, by the way, I want to tell you, as a result of your book, I went back to see it just the other night, just to school myself for this interview and get a sense of it. And it certainly is a period piece and a great film. So I want you to talk about Kubrick and Kazan and their respective great movies of that era, if you will.
Well, Kubrick, as you said, was very young, and he became a film buff at a very early age. Now, we talk later about generation of Martin Scorsese and Quentin Tarantino being film buffs. Kubrick is maybe the first important filmmaker who is like, the fire is lit literally by him sitting in the Museum of Modern Art auditorium, looking at Eisenstein and Chaplin and D.W. Griffith movies like all day long. And that light that ignites this thing. And so he and his friends would just go to see every movie that was made. They'd see all the junk on Times Square, any imported films they could. And he has a job working for Look magazine. And he would do photo essays for Look magazine. And if you remember what that was, they'd assign Stanley, they'd say, do a story about, this prize fighter in his day, and he's going to have a prize fight. So Kubrick would follow this guy around. He'd photograph his house, how he practices. He goes to church before the prize fight. Who is his girlfriend? What did the fight look like? And then these pictures would be laid out almost like a graphic novel in Look magazine with captions. And Stanley would look at those things and said, well, I took the pictures, but somebody else actually did the laying out and putting the captions on them and making the selections. And that's like a movie. And I want to do that because I love movies anyway. So he becomes one of not the only, but one of the early people to say, well, I'm going to make a film. I'm going to get money together, borrow money from my relatives, and it'll be a short. We'll make a short about that prize fighter. And, then I'll sell that for a lot of money to the studios. Well, he actually does make the film about the prize fighter. He's barely able to get his money back selling it to a studio, but it's like he was successful. And he sees the film at the Paramount Theater on Times Square, his short movie. And says, oh, I can do this. So he begins, making films on the equivalent of a credit card. Of course, he didn't have a credit card in those days, but he had some wealthy relatives and he had other people. And he also had this kind of new way of financing films, which was called deferments. They didn't use this in the pre-war period. He would go to, say, the deluxe film labs and say, okay, look, if you give me the film when my movie comes out and it's a big success, then I'll pay you back. And otherwise, look, you don't have too many customers anyway, so why don't you take a chance on me? So first the laboratory and the camera rental companies would give him basically equipment for free on the ferment, but then he would also talk to hungry actors about that. He said, well, I'll pay you a little bit of your fee now, and then the rest will be deferred when the film goes into profit, and here's my plan for it to go into profit. So they said, okay, we'll try to do this. Now, later on, of course, this is the way everybody is going to make films, even easier when you have a credit card, even easier when you have a Kickstarter account. But Stanley Kubrick is one of the first people to actually put this in the process, get films together. So he makes these films. He makes a movie called Fear and Desire, which was going to be shot upstate, but they had to shoot it in the mountains of California because of the time of year. And he makes this movie Fear and Desire, which is like a impressionistic anti-war or war movie. Nobody wants it. Who wants it? So he finds a distributor who will handle it as an art movie, because it looks like a European art movie, So Fear and Desire runs as a European art movie. What are they going to do? He and his screenwriting friends write the screenplay of a kind of a gangster film noir thriller. Well, they didn't have the term film noir in those days, and they make themselves Killer's Kiss. And what I was interested to find out is that Killer's Kiss and On the Waterfront were shot at exactly the same time, the winter of 1953. Kubrick was working in Manhattan and Kazan across the river in Hoboken. But other than that, the films were completely different. They were financed differently. They were written, they were sold differently. They were different types of films. And so by discussing these sort of two streams, I was able to point out how that, yes, these are both independent movies made in New York, but independent really means more than one kind of film and one kind of filmmaking. And the history of New York cinema going forward, some of it is like what Kubrick did, the way Kubrick, and others are like the way Kazan and Sam Spiegel put their film together. Kubrick was very interested in controlling everything about his films. Kubrick did not want to become a, quote, Hollywood filmmaker and work there under contract. You talk about Spartacus, and that film, he took the bait. They showed him the golden apple, and he said, okay, I'll go out there because, man, if I get the credit for working on Spartacus, it'll be worth the pain of having to answer to Kirk Douglas and Lou Wasserman and everybody else who's out there. And he considered Spartacus to be this terrible headache, but Spartacus, of course, moved him up from this kid, this beatnik living in the East Village, and financing, films, from his chiropractor and his uncle, to a real Hollywood filmmaker. He made that big film with Stanley Kubrick, and that's sort of marks the kind of independent cinema that Kubrick made. Is like, I want total control of everything.
Right.
Different than what you see with Kazan, because Kazan.
Well, let's talk about Elia Kazan. I want you to start off by talking about his relationship to the HUAC and how that basically the types of problems and tensions that brought with other Hollywood stars of that period. I think you mentioned when he directed On the Waterfront, Marlon Brando initially didn't want to have anything to do with him and had to be talked into it and so forth. Tell us about that political incident and maybe a little bit about how leftist politics informed the movie industry in that period and the role of Elia Kazan, rather unhappy role, I think, in that circumstance. Yeah.
Well, one way, it's it's indirect to what you're saying, that politics involved New York filmmaking is that people who found themselves blacklisted in Hollywood, they say, where can I go? Can I go to Mexico? Can I go to England? And say, hey, they're starting to make films in New York. So there are some very interesting films made in New York by blacklisted people. There's a movie called So Young, So Bad, which is about a girls' prison, which is made almost entirely by blacklisted people who would never work in Hollywood again. But Elia Kazan, he's a different case, right? I mean, he's out of the 1930s. He's comes up in the group theater and all, and then during the 40s, he becomes the most important American stage director. He directs Death of a Salesman. He directs Streetcar Named Desire. He's got the Hollywood contract, and his films are doing pretty well. Streetcar Named Desire, the film Streetcar Named Desire, it wins various Oscars. He's on the top of his game. But then the HUAC thing comes around, right? And they come around to Elia Kazan, and the idea is, well, he says, well, we know that you were assigned these papers, you were part of these groups. Will you come down and testify to us because we're investigating? Will you come down and testify about your associations? And some people don't do that. Some people do that for various reasons. And Kazan thinks and thinks and thinks, and he says, well, hey, those guys basically kicked me out anyway. I don't agree with what they were saying now, and thinking about it, I don't agree with how I was treated back in the day. So yeah, I'll name a few people.
He was a member of the CP at one point.
Yes, yeah.
Became disaffected. Yeah.
And he named people who were in his cell as part of the group theater. Now, some of them had been named by others already. Some of them hadn't been named by other people. It's a decision that caused people to say, you didn't have to do that. You wouldn't be walking the street selling shoelaces, if Hollywood told you we won't hire you again. You're the most important theater director in America. You could have a very successful career that way or some other way. But on the other hand, Kazan is saying, why should I sacrifice myself for these people who probably they never liked me in the first place, and I don't care about them. It was very, very, very messy. Kazan winds up working on a script. He's trying to develop a script called The Hook. It had to do with the longshoreman's grappling hook with Arthur Miller. And doing this while they're doing Death of a Salesman and the movie Boomerang. And they're trying to sell this movie about longshoremen in New York. And basically everybody's turning it down. And they turn it down because they say, well, Arthur Miller is a commie and you're a commie too. We don't want any of this communist stuff here. Arthur Miller doesn't go into name names, but Elia Kazan does, and that causes this terrible rupture between them. So Arthur Miller and a lot of other people don't talk to Elia Kazan anymore. Kazan, he doesn't like Hollywood. He wants to be making films with more control, with less regimentation, with less sameness. He wants to do something new. He's sitting there in New York figuring out what to do, and he's contacted by Bud Schulberg. And Bud Schulberg is the son of B.P. Schulberg, an old Hollywood executive, and Schulberg was also a member of the Communist Party. And Schulberg had written What Makes Sammy Run, which was an expose of Hollywood tycoons in the 1940s, a best-selling novel. And initially, the party had reviewed What Makes Sammy Run well, except suddenly they decided they didn't like What Makes Sammy Run, that it was an anti-Semitic novel. So they have this session and they say, well, you have to denounce your work and all that. And Bud Schulberg says, who are you to tell me that I'm denouncing your work? I mean, the problem with the Communist Party in Hollywood is like organizing writers. It's like trying to organize cats or something. They're completely uncontrollable. So as soon as you lean on them in terms of their creative decisions, they fled. They went elsewhere. So Schulberg says, I'm leaving you guys. Nonetheless, Schulberg sees in the paper that he's been named as a communist by Wilson or somebody else in one of the early hearings. And he says, well, I'm not a communist anymore. And, if they accuse me of being a communist, it's going to hurt me. So he goes down and he said, oh, I'm going to actually tell you, I'm going to tell you I'm not a communist, and I'll tell you who is. So Schulberg, he names a lot of people, and people say, why did you name me? You didn't have to do that. You were writing best-selling novels. You had a career. So both Kazan and Schulberg are on the outs. Their old friends on the left, don't like them, and they certainly haven't been embraced by the people on the right either. So they're looking for a project, and it turns out that both of them happen to be interested in this waterfront, in the problem of waterfront corruption. They work together on this movie. Now, the movie comes out, everybody's seen the movie today. And people say, oh, yes, it's about HUAC, it's about informing. Well, you have to remember that On the Waterfront is not the first movie about informing made this period. There's a movie called Force of Evil with John Garfield, which is also about informing. There's a movie called Kiss of Death with Victor Mature, which is about informing. So the notion that you would turn against your previous allies is not new. It's not new to On the Waterfront. And as they were developing the script of On the Waterfront, they said, well, we have these ideas about corruption and the bad things, union hiring, how corruption affects but there are these hearings that are going on now. And there was a guy named Tony Mike, and Tony Mike was, he turned, he had been on the dark side, but he decided to give testimony. So Tony Mike gives all this testimony, and Kazan especially is fascinated with Tony Mike. And he said, well, we were originally going to make this film about a waterfront priest who was helping the union, but I'm more interested in Tony Mike, who, had this big moral and ethical change and what that means. And so Kazan begins shifting the script that they write for On the Waterfront to be more about the notion of this person who turns against his old associates, who he now sees in the true light. He now sees that Johnny Friendly is a bad person and not his father. He turns against his father. And in interviews, Kazan would frequently say, "Oh yes, that's me. That's that speech where Marlon Brando says, I'm proud of what I did. That's me. Responding to." People who criticized me for my testimony before HUAC. Bud Schulberg, on the other hand, who's his 50% partner on this and wrote the film, said, "What's he talking about? I wrote the film. Never occurred to me in a million years that the film is about that. I was working on this script for 2 years before either Kazan or me had testified before HUAC. It's about this entirely other set of issues. Now, they've made the same film, and maybe you could say Elia Kazan had his hands on the material last, but to the end of their lives, the two men had completely different views of what that film was actually about. And then, of course, even when it comes out, it has responses all over the map in terms of how it's understood politically. That's a longer story.
Absolutely fascinating. Okay, unfortunately, we're going to have to bring this to a close. I do have one final question, but before I get to the final question, I have one before that. You mentioned twice in the section on the chapter on the waterfront that Marlon Brando had to quit the set at 4:00 every day to meet with his psychoanalyst. And I found that it's a small point, but I found that
this is a common story. And originally they didn't know who was going to be it. They wrote it with John Garfield in mind, but he was that he wasn't going to be in the film. But it's a John Garfield type character. And they're negotiating with Daryl Zanuck to make the film. And Zanuck says, look, I don't know about Waterfront, Longshoreman, but maybe if Marlon Brando was in it, I'd greenlight it. They can't get They can't get Brando. Brando is appalled by this testimony because Brando knows some of the people who were named, and Brando is a father figure to him and many of the other people who come out of the actor's studio. And now they're sending the script to him, and they're sending the script to everybody. They're sending it to Montgomery Clift. They're sending it to Frank Sinatra. They're sending it to Paul Newman. All kinds of people are being considered for this film, and they're going into production. And then suddenly, Sam Spiegel convinces Marlon Brando to make the film, and nobody really knows what the magic was. It's not that he suddenly offered him a lot more money. Nobody knows the reason, but Marlon Brando agrees to make the film. But let's put aside this whole business about I hate you for being a squealer, and now I'm going to play the squealer in your movie. Brando doesn't do that. And of course, the other part, a famous story is there's a screening of On the Waterfront, a rough cut for Brando and for Leonard Bernstein, who's going to do the music, and Marlon Brando gets up before the end of the movie. He walks out and he says, "It's no good. The film is no good. I stink. I don't want anything to do with this." But he did accept the Oscar.
Right, he did. Right, won quite a few
did
Oscars to Hollywood's surprise, as you note. Right, it was really quite an achievement, and again, paradigmatic of the period you're talking about. One final question, take us beyond the book. I'm just curious about your thoughts in this regard. I remember several years ago seeing a Woody Allen film, entitled New York Stories, which were 3 vignettes under the same title. As we move into the current era, Richard, what's the relationship of cinema to New York City and New York City to the movies?
Well, the most important thing is that it's burgeoned as a production center. I mean, New York, first of all, it was almost flatlined. Then yes, there's enough material for me to write a book about. If I look really hard, I can find stuff. But now, and especially in the world of streaming, and we're talking about moving image media, we're not talking about theatrical films as the be all and end all anymore. New York is up there with Hollywood and Atlanta. And according, to some statistics, sometimes there's more activity going on in New York even than Hollywood. Although I think Atlanta may be in first place because the state has thrown so much money into production over there. But and the one thing that actually bothers me about this is, this is the sad part, which maybe it'll be in another book and maybe not. There's so much production. It's so controlled by the regular money business of the streaming industry or the moving, that the local color that I valued, has gone. I mean, those union regulations that I talked about earlier, they dissipated. There's one central union for cinematographers now, so cinematographers can go back and forth. So there is no notion of just people who live locally, like, local people brewing beer, with their own water. It's all going to be very much the same.
Well, that's the way the world unfortunately seems to be going. We're becoming so corporatized that sort of mega mentality is in effect informing so many branches of our culture, our political life, our personal lives, and so forth, and movie making as well. Well, anyway, this has been an absolutely fascinating hour plus talking to you, Richard Koszarski, about your book, Keep 'Em in the East, Kazan, Kubrick, and the Postwar New York Film Renaissance. If you have an interest in movies and movie history, you have to get this book. You have to read it. You have to put it on your bookshelf. It's a true treasure. It's an encyclopedia under covers. Richard Koszarski, thank you so very much. And we thank all our viewers at the Puffin Cultural Forum for tuning in with us. And we'll see you next month with another author interview. Thank you and have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.